Well, I'm James Olley. I'm joined by Mark Ogden and Rob Dawson. How are we, gentlemen? It's obviously a big Champions League week, Europa League week ahead. Where are we? Where are we going?
Yeah, well, I'm off to Paris, PSG v Man City. It's a much bigger game than we expected at this stage of the competition. And who knows? I mean, if City lose, they could be in the relegation zone when it's the final group game. So it's a big week for both teams.
And I've got United Rangers in the Europa League on Thursday. Battle of Britain. You never know what you're going to get with Man United at the moment. I probably do know that Rangers fans are going to come down to Manchester in their thousands, just like they did for that UEFA Cup final in 2008 when they completely took over the city. So I'm looking forward to it.
Well, two big games there, and we're going to focus on City. Ahead of the start of match day 7, they sit on 8 points from 6 games in this new league format, meaning that their future in the competition almost certainly lies via the playoffs. This match day, as Mark says, they travel to Paris to face Paris Saint-Germain, who are in an even more perilous position and sit outside the playoff qualification spots.
City's position has obviously been harmed by that disastrous run of form that they had in November and December. Not only did they fall way off the top spots in the Premier League, but also had some disastrous Champions League results. Threw away a 3-goal lead against Feyenoord, were hammered by Ruben Amorim's Sporting Lisbon, and also lost to Juventus. So in a little bit of trouble in the Champions League as well as the Premier League.
And while a 6-0 win against Ipswich this weekend might indicate they're back towards their best, there's definitely a feeling that this is the start of a new phase for the club. Mark, you've written this week about how a super club empire falls. What have you identified as the telltale signs?
Well, I think there's just 3 trends, and I think these are trends that I spotted with Liverpool in 1990, probably 89-90, and United around the Fergie era. So, and City are beginning to reflect or repeat some of these issues that have kind of befell Liverpool and Man United. So first of all, there's a result that shocks everybody, a result that comes completely out of the blue. Liverpool lost to Crystal Palace in the FA Cup semi-final in 1990. I mean, a few months earlier, they'd beaten Palace 9-0 in the Premier in the old First Division. So that sort of result. And then United, I think the 6-1 at home to Man City in the derby in 2011-12 was a game which that really kind of set in tone the growth of Man City, and it showed that United were a team in decline. So, and then you've got issues such as senior people leaving the club, senior figures, senior executives who let the club run smoothly with astute decisions and a bigger picture. That happened to Liverpool and Man United in 1990 Liverpool, and in 2012-13 at Old Trafford. So, and again, City are losing key personnel, as you know, at the end of this season. I think the final one is just bad recruitment, when the magic touch of signing the right players at the right time or letting players go at the right time begins to evade the club. So that happened to Liverpool in a big way. And it happened to United. I think we saw that Sir Alex Ferguson thought he'd left behind a crop of young players that were going to be the future of the club, and they clearly weren't. So poor judgment on behalf of the people charged with recruitment. So City have got into that trap a little bit. They might pull themselves out of it, having made some signings in January, and they've obviously signed Erling Haaland to a big long contract. But there are certain things that if you get it wrong, it can just tailspin pretty quickly. I think we saw that at Liverpool and United. So maybe it happens at Man City as well.
Well, the two other examples you mentioned there, which obviously are, they had managerial changes. City are trying to enter the dawn of a new era by retaining the same manager. How much does that change the rebuild and the pressure around it? And do we think that Guardiola is in this for the long haul? I mean, if this rebuild does take a year, 2, 3 years, is he going to stick around to see it out?
Well, this is the big question. And, obviously Pep signed a new 2.5-year contract in November. And depending who you speak to, some people think he's there for the long term, for the duration of the contract. Some people think he'll be going in the summer. I wish I knew what the answer was. But, I mean, I'm more inclined to believe that he won't see it out. I just don't think that I just think he looks tired. I think he needs a break. And I think we've seen that on the touchline. We've seen it in his press conferences. We've seen it with his reaction to players. He's had a few issues on the pitch with players, his own players, arguments with certain players. We saw the situation with Stefan Ortega at the weekend. He's had issues with Edison. I think Jack Grealish has been on the brunt of it as well. So I'm not quite sure Pep is there for the long term. And I think a key part of this is the departure at the end of this season of Chicky Pagurishtan, who's been City's director of football, sporting director, call it what you will, since 2012. He was a massive part in Pep going to the club. City basically hired Chicky because he worked with them at Barcelona. They've got a relationship dating back to the team at the time as players together at Barcelona. They're very, very close. Closer than Gil and Ferguson were, and that was the real axis at United. Chicky's leaving at the end of the season to be replaced by Hugo Vallano from Sporting Lisbon. Now, we don't know how that'll work, but that is a massive key part of the success that City have had. Once Chicky goes, Pep loses his kind of wingman in many ways, and we'll see how that develops. Has Pep got the appetite for a rebuild? That's the big question as well. I mean, City's recruitment in January has been long-term signings or medium-term to long-term signings. They're not players that are going to make a difference right away. So is he prepared to allow them to bed in? Is he prepared to overhaul the players? There are lots of players there that are in the 30s now. There's Gundogan, there's De Bruyne, and I think both will leave in the summer. You've got John Stones, you've got Bernardo Silva, you've got Kyle Walker, who would like it to leave this one. So all of a sudden, a lot of the key players of his regime are going to leave or potentially leave. It's a big rebuild. Sir Alex Ferguson did that brilliantly at United, and Liverpool did it over the years between the mid-70s and early 90s. Great players left. Keegan, Souness, Ian Rush, they were all replaced brilliantly until they weren't. And that's the situation City are in right now. Are these great players going to be replaced by better players, or are they going to fall into the trap that United and Liverpool made by signing players that aren't as good and turn out to be nowhere near as good?
I think that we can maybe see some evidence from last summer that Pep isn't that keen for a major rebuild. He was offered the chance to sign more players in the summer and turned it down. He's done a press conference relatively recently where he kind of suggested that bosses, whether that was Begiristan or Soriano or the recruitment staff, were kind of almost sort of pushing him into making signings. And he said, no, I don't want to do that. I want to carry on with the bulk of the squad that I've already built. These kind of, the not old stages, but the kind of experienced guys like De Bruyne and Walker and people that he wanted to kind of carry them through one more season and see what they could do. And I think that injuries has played a part, but also maybe decline has happened a little bit quicker than perhaps Pep thought and perhaps the everyone else at City thought. And now you're faced with a situation where you're having to make not panic signings, but you're having to spend an awful lot more money in January than you would ever expect. And then, as Mark says, you're looking at a situation where you've got an awful lot of kind of players over the age of 30 who need replaced in the summer. I would be amazed if Pep Guardiola has the energy to see that through, because he was already talking 18 months ago about coming towards the end of his time at Man City, and just have to be in a couple of his press conferences, particularly after the World Club Cup in Saudi Arabia last December, where he was talking. He gave a resignation speech without actually resigning. He talked about closing a chapter. We're done. We've closed a circle. We're finished with what we started. It's all over, kind of thing. And then he was obviously forced to start again because he was in the middle of the season. As Mark said, there's an awful lot of people at City who don't think that he will see the end of that contract extension that he's just signed. That part of his motivation to sign it was to kind of stop the questions about his future. When are you going to go? When are you going to go? Are you going to carry on? Are you going to sign it? He looks like a guy who's done absolutely everything at City, and to be faced with a situation where you come out such a fantastic spell of success and then been told, right, that was great, let's start again. For a guy who's done it all, that surely in his head he's thinking, really? He's got golf to play in the Maldives and things. He's got other things he wants to be doing.
Yeah, I think we talk about the trigger result as well. I've referenced Liverpool and the Man United results. I think for City, the one that stands out for me has been a game that set the alarm bells ringing was the cup final last season against Man United. I mean, they went into that game as overwhelming favourites, on course to do the double again. They just won the treble the season before. Nobody gave United a chance because United went into that game, lowest ever Premier League finish. Eric Ten Hag was facing the sack, and United beat them. And United had a plan to beat them. And I think these results that shock you, the results that give opponents and rivals the thinking that actually these guys aren't as invincible as we thought, and the cracks appear. And they started this season in a similar vein, that teams are now playing City without the fear that they once had, because they know that if a team like United, a weak United team, can beat them, then so can they. And I think so many teams have taken City apart at times this season. So I think it's easy to say, we look at Liverpool and United with the benefit of hindsight, and with 20, 30 years in some cases benefit to look at that. But I think in future, when we look back at this City team, when it started to break up, I think the cup final defeat against United we're seen as a significant moment when a lot of things changed.
There was also a similar situation, wasn't there, to a lesser extent with Arsenal, James? I mean, you'll know more about that. There was a similar, to a lesser extent, when Arsenal went through the same thing. They didn't have a period of success that was in the same kind of length or vein that Liverpool, Man United and City have had, but a similar situation where they were kind of the top dogs in England for a spell and fell off in a similar way.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously, it happened slightly differently with Arsenal in that, the manager who had overseen their greatest successes was overseeing what became really a terminal decline. And, you had this really bizarre sort of situation where it sort of split down the generations, that the older, fans inside Emirates Stadium were saying, look, lay off this guy. This is the guy who's given us the invincible season. He's given us, 2 doubles. He's an absolute legend of the game, not just of Arsenal. But over time, when they, were falling away from challenging the title to scrambling to finish in the top 4, and they were, selling players left, right, and centre to self-fund the move from Highbury to the Emirates, and the financial difficulties that followed in those years, there were younger and younger fans coming who were saying, look, I want to watch a team win. I'm paying the highest season ticket price in England, and I'm watching a team that can't, defend and has all these cyclical problems. It lacks leaders. It's got a manager who doesn't look like he's got the answers. And if we're just judging him on the last 5 years, the last 7 years, the last 8 years, the longer that trophyless run went on, it's hard to sort of make the case for this guy, Arsene Wenger, still knowing, being the right man to take the club forward. And eventually that control was wrestled away from him. But I'm sort of quite curious to know whether you think City, for example, would be looking at what happened at United and what happened at Arsenal and think, is there a degree of succession planning with and without Pep here, that we don't want to make the same mistakes that other clubs have made? But, I know for a fact that at Arsenal, they did look at United and what happened post-Fergie and think, well, okay, because there's such similar comparisons. 2 men run the club top down, autonomous control. How do we kind of avoid that? And Arsenal made some big mistakes, don't get me wrong. It's not as if they learned from them and it's been smooth sailing. But do you think that City, people at City are looking at the examples from the past, like we're talking about with Fergie, like we're talking about with Arsene Wenger, and think there are lessons to be learned here?
Yeah, I mean, just for the benefit of Arsenal fans wondering why I didn't include Arsenal in this feature, is because Arsenal didn't really have an empire under Wenger. United, Liverpool had empires that won back-to-back titles. They won European trophies. They took it to a different level than Arsenal. Now, Arsenal were very successful under Wenger, but in many ways they were successful in the years that United weren't, apart from the Invincibles year. So that's the reason why. And obviously Arsenal's decline had a lot to do with issues that are unique to them. The new stadium, like you mentioned, James, that they had to pay for that. So they didn't really have the same high. They didn't scale the mountain as high as Liverpool and United did, or City have done. And I think their fall was a bad one, but it wasn't quite as bad because it hadn't scaled the heights as such. So, but in terms of replacing a genius, United had to do that, and so did Arsenal. And both have shown that it's not possible to do it like for like. And I think City, we don't know what City's plan is. I think City's plan has clearly been, every time that Pep looks like he's leaving, is to give him a big new contract, because there's been probably 2 or 3 times when we thought that Pep would go and he didn't do. So City are maybe kind of just putting it under the carpet and thinking, hopefully one day this will go away. And if Pep is still young enough to stay, but who knows what the succession plan is? Over the years, I've heard different names mentioned. I think Mikel Arteta's been one, but I'm not quite sure that he ticks the boxes. Got to win something big first. He's got to stop being the nearly man. I think, Brendan Rodgers was mentioned at one point, but again, Brendan Rodgers is never going to be the Man City manager now. Mauricio Pochettino, again, did well, tailed off, now managing the US. So there's no obvious candidate out there. Julian Nagelsmann's been mentioned. Ruben Amorim was mentioned because Hugo Viana had left Sporting Lisbon to go to City at the end of this season, but obviously Amorim's now at United. So there's no obvious candidate out there. Patrick Vieira, another name I'm going to chuck in because he was being groomed as their long-term successor. Brought the academy through, went to New York City FC, but again, Vieira's not in the running now. So I think they're probably having that same situation that we're sitting here thinking, who is the guy? But I think City's infrastructure is much stronger than United was. And I think they don't have the issue that Arsenal had, in the sense that having to pay for a ground, and we know that City have got incredible resources, but obviously we don't know what's going to happen with the 115 Premier League charges. I think what happened at Liverpool was very similar to what happened at United. A team got old and a big manager, in their case, Kennedy at least left a big hole. So I don't think City will have the same problem in the sense that Liverpool had with a manager, but I do think they're going to have a problem with just finding a way to replace a genius. And I think just to add to the cheeky departure, we can't overlook the fact that Omar Barada left as chief operating officer to go to Man United. Jason Wilcott left as well to initially go to Southampton and now has ended up at United. So over the last 18 months, they have seen a lot of senior people go, but the key people are still there. The chairman is still Khaldun Al-Mubarak. Ferran Soriano's still there as CEO. I think City is strong enough and well placed to move on, but Pep is such a big figure that I think his departure whenever it is going to be one that City's going to find really hard to overcome.
Well, as Rob said earlier, Guardiola has conceded in the last week that maybe he was wrong telling the club that he didn't need to make any signings last summer. In the last week, they've made moves for Lens centre-back Abdulkadir Kuzanov, Palmeiras centre-back Vitor Reyes, and Eintracht Frankfurt's Egyptian forward Omar Marmoush. Now, that indicates that he does regret not signing players in the summer and that they've had to sort of rectify that this month. Rob, do you think the failure to update the ageing squad last summer will end up being the defining moment for the end of this empire, or can these signings hit the ground running and get them out of trouble this season?
Yeah, I mean, that's the golden question. I mean, I think that if this season is to carries on in the same vein as the start of the season, it will be remembered as kind of that summer will be remembered as kind of the turning point of City's empire, because ultimately I think that the biggest reason that these empires all collapse is recruitment. You know, you start making really, really poor choices. You start chasing your tail in terms of recruitment. You don't get the timing right with signing players and bringing in. And that's obviously something that City have already admitted to sort of last summer. Again, though, Mark is right in that City have given themselves, or have got the best chance to kind of pull themselves back from the brink in a way that maybe Man United and Liverpool couldn't do, because if City bring in these players and they hit the ground running, particularly someone like Marmoush, who is a risk, but if he comes in and scores a load of goals, then suddenly you're a far better team. And then you go and sort of spend more money in the summer. They're probably still in that zone where you can rectify the mistakes that have gone before. Whereas with United and Liverpool, United in particular, they just couldn't ever drag themselves back. They made mistake after mistake after mistake in terms of recruitment. And they ended up having to sign players to replace the guys that they'd signed to replace the other guy before. And it just doesn't ever work. You know, all these super clubs, all these empires get into a sweet spot in terms of recruitment where the squad is so strong and so well balanced in terms of age profile and position profile that every sort of summer you're only looking to add maybe one or two players. And it's a lot easier to do that than if you're approaching a summer having to sign 4, 5 and 6. And that there isn't really much evidence to suggest that you can sign 7 players in a summer and then go on to be immediately successful. The only team I can think of in recent history is when Jose came into Chelsea. And I think he signed 7 players that summer. And then they obviously went on and won the league straight away in 2005. There isn't an awful lot of other evidence to suggest that you can do that kind of squad overhaul and be immediately successful. So if you can get into that sweet spot of recruitment where you're only looking to tweak the squad, it's great. But the minute you fall out of that, you start having to chase your tail, and that's when you make bad choices. So I think we're still in that zone with City where they may be able to pull themselves back, but it'll depend an awful lot on how good Marmoush is, because they're paying a lot of money for him, and it'll depend a lot on how good their recruitment is in the summer. And that's not going to be easy because, as Mark has already said, you're asking Hugo Viana to come in straight off the bat and make some signings that are going to get City right back on track as Premier League contenders. And that's really tough for a guy to come in and have to do that, particularly when you're following someone like Cheeky Begiristan, who's been so successful.
I mean, that, for me, you mentioned there, James, you talked about Pep saying last summer that he didn't need to strengthen his squad and he regrets that. There's real kind of echoes with Ferguson there. A complacency almost setting in that these players have been so good for him that he doesn't need to strengthen at a certain point. Now, time will tell, but is Kuzanov another Phil Jones, or is he Nemanja Vidic? Is Marmoush, a Robin van Persie, or is he Gabby Obertan? The players that Fergie signed in the tail end of his time at United for the last 3 years, and you could probably date it back to when they saw Cristiano Ronaldo, £80 million to Real Madrid, same summer they let Carlos Tevez go to Man City. Michael Owen came in that summer, a free transfer. Antonio Valencia came in. That gradient of quality went down to the point after 2 or 3 years that it was Smalling, it was Bebby, it was Jones, it was Ashley Young. Players that served United well, but were never anywhere near as good as the ones they had in the past. And it got to the point where they missed summer windows, as Rob said, sweet spot. United missed it 2 or 3 times. City may have missed it 2 or 3 times. Why did this bring Ilkay Gundogan back last summer? That was a bad signing. The perfect decision on Gundogan was letting him go the year before. Gundogan could be there. Paul Scholes being brought out of retirement by Fergie. So there are similarities there, but again, we get back to City. The big thing that City have got in their favour is they're still top and they've got immense wall to deal with it.
At one point related to that, I think we should touch on is obviously the number of players they've sold from their academy. You look at You look at it now: Cole Palmer, Morgan Rogers, Romeo Lavia, Tosin. I mean, there's you could list so many of them. I guess linked to that, there've also been, persistent rumours behind the scenes of problems, individuals falling out with Pep. Kevin De Bruyne, probably the most obvious one. Obviously, Kyle Walker's form's fallen off the cliff, looking like he's going to leave. How much of those factors do you think have contributed to this? Firstly, the fact that they've sold players. You talked about complacency earlier. Was there maybe a bit of complacency about selling all of these academy players and thinking, well, we'll just, yes, we need to probably do it for PSR, but we're all right. We can carry on with this. And also selling to rivals as well. It's not as if they're selling these players overseas. They're sort of saying to the rest of the league, we can still sell some of our brightest young talent here and we can still beat you.
Yeah, it's like an arrogance of complacency, isn't it? That, it's all right, these kids are good, but we won't give them the time that would have got elsewhere. I think some of these players were never going to make it to City, let's be honest, but some of them, had they had another year there, I think they would have made it. I think they really would have made it. I think the Liverpools and Man United of this world, and Arsenal, Saka, people like that, they don't let their best young players go. They really don't. They keep them there unless there's a financial reason they have to let them go. City haven't really had that. So I think City are now paying the price. Their next team could have been there, ready and waiting by now. Lavia, Cole Palmer, Morgan Rogers, these players, tossing, like you say, that's the backbone of the team. So I think that is an issue. I think the off-field stuff behind the scenes, a lot of players getting old, a lot of players have run the race, a lot of players have probably been there long enough now thinking, Pep is very, very demanding. And they can't take it anymore, thinking, well, look, when they signed for Man City 6-7 years ago, playing for Pep was this was almost a destination signing, wasn't it, of playing for Pep Guardiola. They've had 6-7 years of him now being ultra demanding, and they're getting to the point thinking, I've won everything, I don't need to hear this anymore. I think that's part of it as well. That never really happened at United because Ferguson moved them on before they got to that point. And the only players that stayed beyond that were players that were those kids, and they had this kind of incredible loyalty and almost this like father figure element to it. I think Pep hasn't got that. So a lot of things are conspiring together. But what happens, I think, between now and the end of the season will tell us whether City are able to bounce back or whether this really is the start of their decline.
Well, we're going to have a quick break, and then after that, we're going to talk about the Liverpool team in the 1990s with a very special guest. One of the most famous super clubs was Liverpool, absolute dominant force in the 70s and 80s, multiple European Cups, 3 First Division titles in 5 years under Kenny Dalglish, plus 2 FA Cups. Dalglish left in early 1991, followed by Ronnie Moran as caretaker, and then Graham Souness as permanent manager. An FA Cup and League Cup followed under Souness until Gerard Houllier and Rafi Benitez. It took 30 years for Liverpool to win their next league title. Now, one of the members of Dalglish's team who stayed at the club through Souness's era was our very own Steve Nicol, who joins us now. Hello, Stevie.
Hey, how you doing?
Thanks for your time. Now, the piece that Mark has written on this points to a key game in each of the super clubs' eras, the moment in which it all seemed to begin to fall apart. And he has singled out the FA Cup semi-final, the 4-3 extra time loss to Crystal Palace. Do you feel that was as significant a moment in Liverpool's history as Mark does?
I actually don't agree. If I was to point to a particular game that seemed to start the downfall, I would suggest it was the 4-4 draw against Everton at Goodison Park. Kenny Dalglish's last game. It was a game in which it just wasn't us. We don't take the lead 4 different times and then give it away on 4 different times. That just wasn't us. Something was wrong. Something was missing. We weren't our usual selves. And what sort of clarified that as well was after the game, coming in, we're expecting a mouthful from Kenny. We're expecting to be told in no uncertain terms what's going on, how we did it wrong, how can we go ahead 4 times and lose 4 leads? But Kenny was silent, and the dressing room was silent, and I always remember thinking, this is strange. Absolutely not like Kenny at all. Just standing in the corner, leaning against the wall, still had his long red coat on and his grey pants, just kind of looking around, just sort of surveying what was going on. Even Ronnie wasn't saying an awful lot. It was just strange. And then of course, we turn up the following day, on the Friday, and Kenny's gone. So for me, really, that was kind of when things started going the wrong way.
The reason I disagree with you, Steve, and obviously I defer to you being a guy in the dressing room at the time, but the 4-3 against Palace, that for me was the first crack in the dam. That never happened to Liverpool. I take what you're saying about you never conceded 4 leads, but back in 89-90, you'd hammered Palace 9-0 in the league back in the September. So to lose 4-3 to the same team in an FA Cup semi-final 7-8 months later, a team that at that point were struggling against relegation, it was like, this never happens to Liverpool. And that's why I picked the game, because I think when a club as successful as Liverpool have a result like that against a team that they're expected to beat, it leads people to ask the questions, and that's when they start focusing on the age and the lack of the poor recruitment. And I think you're right, the Everton game was a seminal moment in the club's history because of what happened a couple of days later. But I do think that the rot had set in at that cup semi-final because of what followed in the years later.
Yeah, I mean, thinking about the game, I disagree with you. We should have been a couple up at half time. We dominated the first half. Should have been a couple up. And, particularly semi-finals and cup games, you expect the same thing to happen in the second half. It doesn't normally happen in most games anyway, when you're so dominant and you don't take your chances and you don't get yourself into a position of just trying to see the game out. And so that's why I disagree with you. But then maybe you're coming at it from a different angle.
Stevie, can you give us an idea of what it's like to be in the dressing room when, I don't want to say it's all falling apart, but obviously one of the reasons we're talking about this is because of what's happened to City this season. And I think everybody in August thought, okay, City are either going to win the league or are going to be, bang there yet again. Nobody really saw this drop off coming. And it happened so quickly, so fast. What is it like when you're a player in the dressing room? You're used to winning every week, and suddenly you can't seem to win a game for love nor money.
Well, in your brain, you're searching. You're trying to figure out. Number one, you're trying to figure out, is it you? Am I doing something? Is it me? And then you're looking to the coaches and the manager to sort it out. When you're playing, everybody knows better. But then when things really start to go wrong, you're looking for something. You're looking for help. You're looking for somebody to give you that magic answer or to do a certain thing that's going to change it all. And so the fact that Kenny leaves and then Ronnie takes over, and Ronnie completely changes when he becomes the manager, because you have to. You can't. Ronnie's day-to-day was always about being on everybody, making sure everybody was absolutely at it. And when he became the manager, then obviously that changes. You can't do that when you're the manager. So everything was changing. And again, as a player, when it's going wrong, inside your head, you're searching to find out what... You always think it's one little thing that'll change it. When at the end of the day, it's not just one little thing. It's a lot of things that add up that make a team that was as good as we were just not function properly.
And Steve, beyond those things, also in this piece, I've identified that it's not just what happens on the pitch; it's off the pitch as well. Now,
yeah,
obviously we know that there's a really important axis at Liverpool. Peter Robinson, the CEO, John Smith as chairman. Now, John Smith was chairman for 17 years between 73 and 1990. Liverpool won 11 league titles, 4 European Cups, 2 UEFA Cups, 3 FA Cups, and 4 League Cups. Now, obviously, the chairman did not make the decisions on the pitch, but during that time, Liverpool had to replace Bill Shankly as manager, they had to replace Bob Paisley as manager, Joe Fagan, Kenny came in. All these decisions were absolute masterstrokes. Players left like Kevin Keegan, Graham Souness, Ian Rush. Again, the join was not seen. It was a perfect transition. So when John Smith left, it kind of broke up that relationship with Peter Robinson. Do you think that kind of has a comparison to David Gill leaving Man United and maybe even Chicky Bergostan leaving City?
It's very difficult for me to answer that because we really didn't know what goes on upstairs. But you can't argue with what you've just said. I think the key to all that, though, is that all those managers you spoke about were already ensconced in the building.
But it took his wisdom, I guess, and courage to promote those people as managers when it could have been easier to go outside and get a Brian Clough or a Bobby Robson. Do you know what I mean? They stuck with their principles.
I think the reason they had to go out with the building is because there wasn't anybody in the building that really looked to be the natural successor. I mean, all those names that you spoke about there, I guess probably Paisley would be one that wouldn't be a natural successor. But, they recognised who was actually in the building and who was capable. I guess that was the masterstroke of Robinson and Smith, that they understood that the people that were actually there at the time could take over and make it seamless. I guess that's the masterstroke. Now, when Kenny left, there wasn't anybody in the building capable of doing that. I think that's the key. I'm not so I don't know whether it's a case of, the chairman leaving or not, but I think they were forced to go out with the building because there wasn't anybody there that was capable of carrying on where Kenny and Joe and Paisley and Shankly had left off.
And what about recruitment? Because I know when we spoke on the phone about this, that Kenny's last two signings were David Speedie and Jimmy Carter. Now, David Speed had a very quick rush of goals, but I think the pair of them played about 20 games altogether. Was that a sign of the club going off-piste in the sense of what they were signing, what they were doing? It was unusual for Liverpool to make those signings.
I think that's the sign of what was going on with Kenny, as opposed to anything else. We needed a couple of fresh faces to liven things up. Speedy, as you said, came in and scored some goals. Jimmy didn't quite work out, but it's not the first time a player hasn't worked out. You can't always get everything 100%. But I think more than anything, it was a sign of the kind of where Kenny was. When we spoke, every single thing from the minute I went to Liverpool in '81, the first thing that hits you is every single thing that goes on in the building is catered towards a Saturday at 3:00 in the afternoon. Every single thing. The kids, the training. I mean, just you name it. Everything was all about the first team. And that changed. Hillsborough, I think we have to mention Hillsborough as well, because that's a big factor. Because that focus that I'm talking about, that completely changed after Hillsborough. The focus on everything, or it seemed like it, was to look after the families and try and sort out what was going on with Hillsborough. And the first team kind of became second. So again, that's another layer. So you've got the chairman leaving, you've got the cloud hanging over the club at Hillsborough. You've got Kenny's health affected by Hillsborough. He's still trying to keep us top of the tree. There's no obvious successor, as we've said. So, the fact that again, it's just another layer upon layer that's going wrong.
At what point after Kenny left and Graham Souness came in did you think, we're not on our way back here? We're just not Liverpool anymore?
Liverpool always, at the end of every season, sitting on top of the tree, would always make a signing or a couple of signings that basically kept us there for 25 years. And all of a sudden, when Graham came in, and don't forget, FIFA, UEFA changed the rules now. We were a team that was full of so-called foreigners. Scots became foreigners, Irish became foreigners, Welsh were foreigners. And so there had to be an influx of English players. Otherwise, if you get into Europe, you can't play. So Graham Souness had no choice to come in and get rid of a lot of players. A, because they were foreigners, and B, because, we're getting a little bit older. So Liverpool went from signing one, maybe two players at the end of a season to Graham Souness having to sign 6, 7 and 8 players. So again, another layer on top of problems.
What was it like, Stevie? Those, I know you were there till 1994, I think.
Yeah.
So there was a couple of years after you'd won that last league title. As one of those senior players, what were those last couple of years like at Liverpool?
not enjoyable. Again, you try to figure out what's going wrong, and I think a lot of things changed as well. The how can I put this? There was a certain type of player would come to Liverpool, and that was a humble, keep your head down, work as hard as you can, keep your mouth shut, take in what's going on around you. Kind of an old school temperament, and all of a sudden, all the younger players, and not just the younger players, but even the established players, started becoming sort of big timers. Everybody was cocky. Everybody had an attitude. Everybody almost kind of, it was about them, and it had always been about the guy next to you. So there was a change in character of the types of players that were at Liverpool as well.
The Spice Boys.
Pardon?
The Spice Boys. Is that what we're talking about here?
Well, it actually ended up accumulating into the Spice Boys probably, a couple of years after I left. But
Which Spice for you, Stevie?
That Spice Boy thing started early 90s. I'm sorry, probably coincided with Kenny leaving. Let me just put it that way. It seemed to kickstart after Kenny left.
Steve was Old Spice.
I'm definitely Old Spice. Splash it all over, those that don't know.
Do you see any comparisons with City, Steve? Obviously, I think, they've had a couple of good results the last week or so, the 6-0 Ipswich, but, letting the kind of core team get old, uncertainty over the manager, people leaving like Chicky Baguri staying. Do you think City have got signs, or are you kind of thinking they're still here for the long haul?
Well, I think it's a little early to say that they're going to go the same way. It's not only has it caught them off guard, it's caught us off guard. Nobody saw this coming. I mean, this is edge of the cliff stuff. But the finances, the backing they have, you got to think that this season is going to be a blip. They've already showed intent by signing Haaland to an almost 10-year contract. So I think it's a little bit early to say that, they're falling off they've certainly fallen off the cliff in terms of going for the title, but I think it's a little early to say that they're falling off the cliff in terms of they're not going to win a title for another 30 years. Let's put it that way.
All right. Well, thanks, Stevie, for joining us. It's time for a break. When we come back, we're going to look at the end of Manchester United and their empire under Sir Alex Ferguson. Manchester United 1, Manchester City 6. A result described by then-manager Sir Alex Ferguson as the worst in my history. The 10-goal difference swing that day ultimately ended up deciding the Premier League title as City won it at the death. Mark, how was it symbolic as the end of an era for United?
Well, there's lots of reasons, but first of all, United under Ferguson never experienced a home defeat like that. They'd lost some away games. There was a couple of 5-0s at Newcastle and Chelsea. They were blips, but I think both those years they won the league. On this occasion, City were the rising force. Ferguson had called them the noisy neighbours a couple of years earlier. He dismissed them a few times. He said they were a small club with a small mentality. He couldn't quite get his head around the fact that City were a force that were there to be reckoned with. He felt that he didn't really give City the respect that he gave to Liverpool or Arsenal. He felt those were true clubs, true heavyweight clubs, and he felt that City were upstarts. He didn't really believe that they were going to come good. And this was a day when it was obvious. They were spending United off the pitch. I outspend United off the pitch massively. Ferguson accused them of kamikaze spending. There was an element of Ferguson not wanting to believe it. But this was the day then when City turned up and hammered United, humiliated United. I think from that point on, it was clear that City were the rising force, and United's team that day was old. It was creaking. It lacked ideas. It lacked energy. The poor recruitment of years gone by was starting to show. They had an old team of people like Rio Ferdinand, Nemanja Vidic, Ryan Giggs, the players that had had their best days. City were the rising force, and although United took City to the wire that season in terms of the title race, they lost it on goal difference, and the 10 goal swing in that game that gave City the title. They won it by a goal difference of +8. So had United not lost so heavily, they could have won the league. But that for me set the tone. It was a day that it showed that City were on the up and United were on the way down.
Fergie left obviously in 2013, and that summer David Gill left as well. I mean, it's often said that those two departing at the same time was sort of a double blow that few clubs could have recovered from. I mean, is that kind of how you see it, or should there have been more of a succession plan, more of a kind of stepping up internally in terms of taking responsibility when two big figures like that leave the club?
Well, there should have been a succession plan, and United will argue there was a succession plan. The succession plan was promoting Ed Woodward from his role as commercial director to executive vice chairman or David Gill's job, but Ed Woodward wasn't cut out for it. And I think as the years have passed, we've realised how important David Gill was. Gill had the connections in the transfer market, he knew the agents, he knew the clubs. He was very well regarded and respected, David Gill. Nobody will say that David Gill was bad at his job. People might think that he was, classic Man United in the sense that United got their way a lot of the times, but that was because they were a powerful club. But David Gill knew the market, he knew the club. I think with Ed Woodward coming in at the same time as David Moyes, there was kind of naivety and inexperience in the two key positions at the club. And had David Gill stayed to guide David Moyes through his first year in charge, I think it would have been different. I think it would have enabled United to get get players in that summer. I think United really struggled. They brought Marlon Fellaini and it was a disaster. I think David Gill would have been a much better guiding hand and would have negotiated the transition much better with Gill in charge as the chief exec. But, Ed Woodward took the club in a different direction. David Moyes, then Louis van Gaal came in. But, Gill leaving, who knows what will happen at City, whether Bagheeristan's departure will be seen as such a big thing. But I think it could be. I think Gill and Ferguson were joined at the hip. They had a real respect for each other. And Gill was one of the very few people that could stand up to Sir Alex Ferguson and tell him he was wrong. And that is crucial as well. You need a powerful figure at a club to be told sometimes, tell truths to power. Bagheeristan could tell that to Pep Guardiola. Gill could say it to Ferguson. I don't think when Woodward came in, the same respect was there from the players or even the manager. I think David Moyes was infuriated at times by Ed Woodward. And I think that carried on with Van Gaal, with Mourinho. So they lost a real power broker, the brains trust. And that's why United, their decline was accelerated by the fact that they had novices off the pitch as well as on it.
Rob, I mean, obviously United won the title in Fergie's final season. Robin van Persie, a fantastic signing, top goal scorer, kind of delivered them the league, made the difference that year. But do you think there were signs perhaps that Sir Alex Ferguson's judgment was waning a little bit in the market in terms of their signings? Did that have any factor in what came after that? The squad that David Moyes inherited did have some fundamental problems that perhaps should have been addressed a little bit earlier.
Yeah, I mean, they certainly made some mistakes towards the end of Sir Alex Ferguson's time. They didn't really reinvest the money that they got from Cristiano Ronaldo's sale to Real Madrid in the right way. I know lots of fans were particularly underwhelmed with the players that were brought in after Ronaldo had gone. Also, they lost Tevez to City, which was not only an embarrassment really that he ended up at City, but also a massive chunk of that forward line that had won the Champions League in 2008 with Tevez, Ronaldo and Rooney. I think then it was almost like a perfect storm that you've got an aging squad. You've not really sort of made the right moves to kind of re-energize it. I'd done a United piece with Frans Herk relatively recently, who was Louis van Gaal's goalkeeping coach, who said that one of the first things that United had told Van Gaal and his coaching staff when he came in was that this squad is old and that they shouldn't have really won the title in 2013. They won the title in 2013 because Van Persie had been so fantastic, and that was the only real reason why they'd won it. And that a situation there from that team that Evra, Vidic, Ferdinand all left in the same summer. I think Van Persie just wasn't the same player again after 2013. You've got Ed Woodward, as Marcus said, coming in to try and help David Moyes, two inexperienced people in their roles. And also the market was changing at the same time, that historically under Fergie, United would be able to go to big Premier League teams and take their best player. You're thinking of examples like Michael Carrick, where you just go to Tottenham and go, right, we're having him, and he comes, and that's it. The market was changing at that time, whereas with other Premier League clubs having a lot of money, that United couldn't do that. And I remember speaking to Woodward a few times where he said, it would have been better for him if Fergie had stayed for one more year, so he got to work with Ferguson and then had kind of tried to oversee this transition. But also he struggled in the market because the way that David Gill used to be able to operate, he just couldn't do it, because you couldn't go to Premier League teams anymore and just pluck their best player out of there. So United had this perfect storm between sort of 2011 2015-16, where they just got so much wrong. There was so much against them. And to be honest, they're still paying the price for it now. We're talking about the best part of 10 years later, and they're still paying the price for that little period where they just didn't get anything right.
It did start on the Fergie. I mean, I'm just... So when he retired in 2013, he had Giggs, who was 39, Scholes was 38. You had Rio Ferdinand, 34, Vidic, 31, Petrusev, 32, Michael Carrick, 31. So that shows you the team have got old, and Ferguson denies that, but there's no denying it. And Pep Guardiola's saying the same things, by the way. This team isn't getting old. It is. But I look back through Ferguson's book, and he made this kind of telling quote about the players that he kind of left behind as the next generation. And he got it wrong, massively wrong. He said, I had a core of players who were sure to improve. Rafael da Silva, Phil Jones, Chris Smalling, David De Gea, Tom Cleverley, Danny Welbeck, Javier Hernandez, and Anderson. Now, all of those players were probably good squad players. I think David De Gea was probably better than that, but good squad players, nothing more than that. They were nowhere near capable of replacing the players that went before them. But
didn't you once say Phil Jones was like the best United,
best player
could be the best United player ever?
Yeah,
I don't care.
Yeah, it was. That was. I don't know what to say about that really, but that's what he said. He said, but at the time, he had this phrase. Whenever Ferguson was being questioned about the spending, they were going nowhere near what City was spending. He said, "I'm looking for value in the market, value in the market." And a lot of fans, even now, will say that what Ferguson was doing was basically doing the bidding for the Glazers, because without getting too deep into the weeds of this, back at that point, it was just after the financial crash, the global crash, and the Glazers were really struggling. The interest on the loan, which was used to buy the club, was getting bigger and bigger. They had real problems, and there even to this day there are question marks as to whether they sold Ronaldo for £80 million. It was a cash deal straight up front. That was done to basically keep the banks at bay. So United were in a mess at the time, and Ferguson was almost like tacit in allowing these signings to happen. That they were going for players that were never going to be good enough at low fees. Chris Smalling, Valencia, all these players that weren't quite up to the mark, and that was his legacy. His legacy was as a winning, incredible manager. But his legacy was also the team that he left behind and the players he left behind.
Was there also part of it was the sort of cult of the manager? I always remember reading Sir Alex Ferguson's book, the one that Paul Hayward did, and control was such a big theme throughout that. You always talked about, I needed to have control at all times. And when you sort of compare what Arsenal did in the post-Wenger era, where they sort of tried to strip the autonomy, or did strip the autonomy from the manager, they appointed Unai Emery, they made him head coach, they appointed all these new department heads, tried to get a load of football expertise in around the club and sort of divest that responsibility away from one man. It felt as though, I mean, ironically, of course, what Arsenal have done under Arteta is kind of give a lot of that back to one man. But this is the sort of vagaries of trying to run a top level club, I suppose. But do you think that idea that one man is the Messiah, one man can still be the autonomous or all conquering force, that lingered too long at United? For succession managers who followed Ferguson, they had to sort of be that role, and there wasn't enough expertise, there wasn't enough people taking responsibility around that individual, and that they held on to that idea too long.
Oh, 100%. Way too long. I mean, Rob, to say was me, I had conversations with Ed Woodward going back to 2013. We said, no, this is our model. The manager's in charge. We don't want a technical director or sporting director. And it went on for probably a good 4 or 5 years. They brought Louis van Gaal to be the Ferguson type. They felt that David Moyes didn't have the credentials or the personality that they needed. So they brought in Louis van Gaal, who was, probably worse than David Moyes in the sense that he wasted so much money. So yes, they waited and waited, and then they wanted to bring in a sporting director under Jose Mourinho, but he vetoed it. I wouldn't work with the suggestion. So also there's a sense that this was Ed Woodward's train set in many ways. He wanted to play, fantasy football manager, and he did quite a lot. You look at some of the players that he signed. So even now, I mean, 2025, they're under Ineos control. They're still making mistakes. They still haven't got it right. They're still 5 or 6, 7 years behind other clubs. And I think Jim Ratcliffe said recently in an interview that United's data and their scouting is in the last century, so it shows how far behind they are.
It's interesting that Radcliffe would say that, because essentially United, after Ferguson, almost had to start from scratch, because he took over in 1986. Football was a very different business in 1986, and you could have a manager who was involved in everything, who kind of took ownership of everything. In 1986, Fergie was still running youth team sessions 2 nights a week on a Tuesday and Thursday. Now that just shows you the kind of landscape that football was at the time, and the club got so big and so successful during Ferguson's reign that it was almost allowed to grow around him. that he was almost like every single department head, because he was a freak in the way that he worked and the way that he was able to kind of squeeze success out of everything. But when you remove a man like that, you're left with a shell, an empty shell, and it can't be filled by anyone else apart from that one man. And that's what David Moyes found, that essentially that it was billed as this kind of perfect job, everything's set up for success. All you have to do is kind of steer the team. Well, that was completely wrong. He was asked to fill a Fergie-shaped hole when he was clearly never going to be that. And what happened is they've had to strip back the club and start almost building the club behind the scenes from scratch. And Mark mentions there about data. The same is true about recruitment. All these departments that didn't really have to function because Fergie was all of these things wrapped into one. United have had to start to try and build from scratch. And again, they're still trying to do it now. And we're talking about more than 10 years on from Fergie retiring.
It's impossible to overstate, what a big personality he was. I remember being on the pre-season tours that United had back in the late 2000s and early 2010s, and they used to do it a lot bigger than anybody else. United were really the kind of the forerunners of pre-season tours. It was like being on Air Force One and travelling with the President of the United States, because he everywhere he went, he was the most famous person in the room, in the building, in the city. People would, stop the clocks because Ferguson was there. It was absolutely huge. There's nothing quite like him. And, Pep Guardiola at Man City is a massive figure, but he hasn't yet become the Ferguson figure, because there are other people at the club that are just as important. Ferguson, he suffocated everybody around him because he was such a big, big personality, and he kind of encouraged that as well. It wasn't that he didn't see it coming, think I need to delegate here. He delegated on the training pitch, but he was always the boss. He was always the guy that was in charge. So when he left, Woodward would say that there was a black hole there, a black hole in many senses, that in terms of scouting, but also his presence. And, they tried everything. They tried Moyes, they tried Van Gaal, they tried Mourinho, all these, the big personalities, the small personalities, the Fergie clone, the ex-player, and none of it worked, because even now, he was on the pitch at the weekend when the Dennis Law tribute. Ferguson, everything stops for Fergie. And he's just got an incredible presence.
This is obviously a sort of secondary point, and I guess maybe it's more symptomatic of everything that we've been discussing, but I sort of think about the way that Carrington has, been left behind by other more progressive training grounds. And obviously the stadium, Old Trafford, has fallen into a bit of a state of disrepair, and they're talking about, maybe knocking it down and building a new one or renovating it, whatever they're going to do this summer. I mean, I always think about I speak to agents when they're talking about moving a player into a Premier League club, and they talk about having tours of training grounds and stadiums and things. And, Spurs, I think Spurs is probably the best combination in England, actually, of stadium and training ground. The facilities are unbelievable. Think about what Liverpool have done in the last few years to Anfield. Obviously, Everton are building a new stadium. There's City have got the Etihad, which is, sort of still relatively, I was going to say state of the art, but still very modern anyway, certainly by comparison to Old Trafford. I mean, how much of a contributing factor to the sort of decline and fall of Manchester United are the fact that the facilities have sort of fallen behind even some of their more modest Premier League rivals?
I think it's just a symbol, another symbol of the decline, that particularly when that Carrington facility opened, it was billed as the best training ground in the world, and it probably was. But in the meantime, City have moved from Platt Lane in Manchester to Carrington, next door to United's training ground, and then moved out of that Carrington facility back into a state-of-the-art facility opposite the Etihad Stadium. And that sums up how much United have just stood still. They've not reinvested. They've not invested in the training facilities to keep it at the top of European football. Anyone that's been to Old Trafford will know that it's the same with the stadium. I mean, everyone's seen the leaky roof. There's videos of rats and mice on the pitch during games. It's just a more evidence of the decline of the entire club. That the team was the best in Europe not that long ago. The facilities were the best in Europe not that long ago, and now they've been overtaken by almost everyone.
But I mean, I was told a story by somebody who works at United, and this is it's the elephant in the room that we haven't really discussed. It's the Glazers, and it's the Glazer family and their ownership of the club, and how since 2005, much of the money that United earned goes on interest payments and paying the debt on the loan that was used to buy the club. So the lack of investment in the club dates back to 2005. But I was told, I asked this person, I said, when United go to America, why do they never go to Tampa? Why do they never go to, because obviously, James, you know that Arsenal will do a link up with the LA Rams or with whoever Kroenke's teams are. Liverpool did it with FSG in Boston. They spend a lot of time. The United have never got anywhere near Tampa where, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, the Glazers own in the US. And I was told it's quite simply because the owners didn't want the United squad to see how good the Tampa Bay facilities were. They didn't want to see the training ground because the training ground at Tampa is meant to be state of the art. The stadium, again, is a top stadium. The Glazers have put a lot of money into the facility at Tampa. And if the players had gone to Tampa Bay Buccaneers training ground and realised what they had and what United don't have, there might have been a mutiny at the club. So that explains why Old Trafford and Carrington have fallen behind, because the owners, the Glazers, haven't put any money in. It's always been going out, £70 million a year on dividends, on interest payments, on, director fees, consultancy fees. United are paying for the privilege of having the Glazers as their owners. So that's why Old Trafford and the Carrington and the team has fallen behind, because of the owners.
Well, that's all for this week. We'll be back next week to look at the 1 year anniversary of Jurgen Klopp announcing his departure from Liverpool. We'll see you all then.